Something new. He's a master at it. A little bit of a background. The first time I gave a talk on this subject to a group like this, I was talking about the brain, and afterwards a woman in the audience very respectfully pointed out to me that the brain has nothing to do with it, it's all the diaphragm. That was my aha moment. So at any rate, what I'm going to do today is talk to you about work that I've been doing and others in our field about understanding how the brain controls the voice. And let's see, so this, you got the right button to press here. So just we're going to talk a little bit about the introduction to the brain, general organization of the brain for voice control, specific locations of the brain that are involved in voice control, and we'll talk about studies of the functional areas of the brain involved in voice control. So we begin with the diaphragm. Where else? Okay. So we're all right. A lot of you are singers or voice teachers. We know the diaphragm is important. So how do we control it? Okay. Well, first of all, we know that it's involved in respiration, and we need that breath support for speech and singing. Now, the diaphragm happens to be controlled by the phrenic nerve. Now, the phrenic nerves, there's two of them, they exit the spinal cord up around C2 to C3, and they drop down through the thorax and innervate the diaphragm. Now, this is a very unusual pattern, but it explains something very important. Namely, if an individual has a severe injury, a back injury, for example, they may have damage to the spinal cord so that they're paralyzed beneath that, okay? But it's not that case with the diaphragm. You can have a fairly high injury and still be able to breathe. But in an unfortunate occurrence where you get a fracture at C2 to C3, like happened with Christopher Reeve, then you have paralysis of the diaphragm, and unless the patient is given immediate medical attention, they'll die. So that's an interesting fact about innervation of the diaphragm. Okay, so moving on now to the nervous system as a whole. We're going to talk about the human nervous system. It has like 100 billion neurons or cells, huge number. And they form very complex networks of fibers that we're just beginning to understand. It's very difficult to understand this and study it. But these neurons interact with each other, sensory receptors, they control muscles and glands. And this is just an artist's image of a couple of neurons there. They're the tiny structures with these filaments that spread out to make contact with other cells, forming these various networks. And because of the fact that they're so tiny, they're hidden within the skull, it's very difficult to study them. So we need some fairly advanced techniques in order to do this. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take you through sort of a step-by-step logical progression to try to understand some of the intricacies of the system. So we'll begin with the peripheral nervous system, and then we'll move on to the central nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system has neurons, two different types, sensory neurons and motor neurons. Now, the sensory neurons are connected to receptors. We're all familiar with these. These are these structures in the skin, for example. And if we poke our finger against a tack, we feel it. We feel the pain. Okay, so the stimulation that hits our finger travels along a sensory neuron. It goes into the spinal cord or the brainstem. And we also have sensory neurons coming from the ear. That goes into the brainstem to give us information about what we're saying or speaking. Eventually, the auditory inputs go up to a part of the brain that we call the auditory cortex, where the brain makes sense of all this input coming in from the ears. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, we also have motor neurons. And motor neurons They have cell bodies located in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and they send fibers out to the muscles. So here's an example of a reflex in which a person burns their finger, and the pain goes into the spinal cord, and it makes connections with motor neurons, and the motor neurons go out to the muscles and cause the arm to retract. So we can think very simply about these things in terms of a simple reflex, but you have to bear in mind that when we're doing anything like I'm moving my arm now, these are motor neurons controlling my muscles. And we also have to think in terms of motor neurons controlling the muscles that Dr. Sadaloff just informed us about. So we also use motor neurons for controlling the diaphragm, as what I already mentioned. Extremely important for both respiration and speech. And we have motor neurons controlling muscles of the larynx that Dr. Sadaloff talked about. And here, of course, we see an image of the inside of the larynx and the vocal folds. And, of course, the muscles lying within the vocal folds, they are also innervated by motor neurons. So, how do the neurons in the brain work to produce the voice? That's one of the things we're really after in not only the research I do, but others as well. We want to understand all these mechanisms. So, to begin with, we can look at the cerebral cortex. This is the type of picture of the brain that most of us are familiar with if we Google an image of the brain or look through a textbook. And we see there are various locations. In the front part of the brain, we call it the frontal lobe. This is an area of the brain that's involved in motor control, conscious thinking about our actions. We can summarize that as a personality, meaning the sum total of our personality is what we do. These are largely controlled by neurons in the front part of the brain. In the posterior part of the brain, we have various structures. We have the more occipital part, which is the visual cortex, and that's the furthest posterior part of your brain. And then we move into the temporal lobe down on the side, and our information from the ears arrives at the temporal lobe, where we sort out the frequencies of the sounds we hear, and we also have some sense of smell in this area as well. Now you see that sort of in the middle, in the front part it's labeled motor cortex, and right behind that it says somatosensory cortex. Somatosensory cortex is where these we get the sensory information that's, say, arising from all parts of our body where we can feel something. And yes, the larynx is represented in the somatosensory cortex where we appreciate sensations arriving within the larynx. Then just posterior to that, we have what's called somatosensory association cortex. This is an amazing part of the brain that puts together the world around us. That is, we bring in the visual information, hearing information, the feelings, and we literally construct the world around us. There are injuries that occur to this part of the brain in which people just don't have a sense of part of their world. There are clinical cases of a person trying to throw this leg out of his bed because he didn't know how it got there and he didn't know what it was doing in his bed. It was his own leg. He just happened to have an injury to that part of the cortex. Pressing the wrong button here. Okay, here it got bigger. My association cortex was working there. Okay, here's another view. On the upper right, we see the outside of the brain, but in the lower foreground, we see an image of the brain cut right down the middle, so we can look at the inside of it. And one of the things to point out to you, towards the bottom, we see the spinal cord coming up, and we enter the area that's called the brainstem. And then we go above that, and there's some other structures as well. The way I like to teach neuroanatomy with students is to begin at that level, to talk about the lower part of the brainstem. And it's divided into 3 or 4 different structures. The lowest portion is called the medulla, and above that we have the pons, and above that the midbrain. So here we have these 3 major components of the brainstem. The spinal cord at the bottom connects to the medulla, and then the pons is above that, and then the midbrain. Now, in the medulla, this is an extremely important part of the brainstem because this is responsible for many of our basic life functions, including respiration, laryngeal control, swallowing, food ingestion, tongue control. Okay? And there's neurons there that help regulate heart rate as well. So the medulla is really important, especially for those of us who are interested in the field of speech and language pathology or singing, because we are interested not only in the control of the tongue, but the control over our larynx and respiration. So this is really vital for the types of things that we're all interested in. And also, so we have sensory information coming into these regions, and then from these nuclei, we have motor neurons going out to these structures such as the larynx and muscles of respiration. So that's the medulla. Now, moving up to the pons, here we get into sort of more advanced functions. Namely, we get inputs in the pons from the ear, from our jaw, lips, pharynx, ear, etc. So this is higher up, and it's not quite as critical for basic life functions, but it's really important for communication and singing because we have to control, say, the muscles of the jaw and our lips, etc. And also eye movement control is another factor. Now, we move up further and we get to this structure called the midbrain. Now, here's where things get much more complex, where we have groups of neurons that orient us towards stimuli. For example, a flash of light and we look at it. We hear a loud sound and we respond to it. We jump. We're disturbed by it. Okay? So we have these higher order functions relating to eye control and hearing. And we also have some other primitive but important functions, fleeing or fighting, and I highlighted bold, scream, vocalization, because this is a part of the brain where we actually have basic screaming functions occur. And along with this, I just want to talk about some of the types of vocalization that are controlled in the midbrain. So, brings us to the question, how does the nervous system control the voice? Well, one way I like to think about it is from the evolutionary perspective, where we think of the simplest, not the simplest animals, I'm thinking mammals here, okay, not crickets. But starting with small rodents, where they have minimal vocalizations, but they have to be controlled someplace in the brain. But in the more primitive types of animals, vocalizations form purposes such as for reproduction, survival, nurturing, training, group cohesion and bonding, and in us, speech. So we have to be aware of the fact that our speech mechanism arose out of these more primitive systems. Now, this is a cross-section of the brain, and I want to point out to you a region that's labeled the central gray. Some people also call it the periaqueductal gray. It was found in 1928 that if you electrically stimulate that in an anesthetized animal, the animal will scream. That's why some people call it the scream center. And here are some spectrograms of monkey vocalizations elicited by stimulating that part of the brain in an anesthetized animal. And depending on where you stimulate, you get different types of vocalizations. Here's some work we did. This is an awake monkey. The upper part of the graph shows the thyrohyoid, posterior cricoarytenoid, and cricothyroid muscles activated by stimulation. Those sharp vertical lines there, those are stimulus pulses. And we see that the thyrohyoid was activated, and the posterior cricoretinoid was suppressed, and cricothyroid was activated. Then we move down to the bottom, and we see in a different place where the thyrohyoid is suppressed, posterior cricoretinoid is suppressed, and cricothyroid is excited. So no matter where you stimulate, you can get different patterns of activity from these different parts of the central gray. And then here, this was in an anesthetized animal where we stimulated and it elicited the vocalization, but we also recorded subglottal pressure. And we can see that first of all, there's an inhalation when the air has been inspired, then it's released and we get the vocalization. So you can observe all of this in the central gray. So, another important thing now to think about with the central gray is that it's the output of the limbic system. Now, we think of the limbic system as that part of the brain that controls our emotional expression. Okay, so we have various areas higher in the brain that provide us with functions related to emotions, and that information comes down through the central gray and then distributed down to lower parts of the brain. So all of our emotional expressions gets funneled through the central gray, and along with that it controls the emotional vocalizations. And then from the central gray we get projections down to the motor neurons located lower, like in the medulla and pons that I already mentioned. So we can think then, like when I mentioned the fact that we'd stimulate and get vocalization in the animal, well, stimulating the central gray causes neurons to send their fibers down to like the nuclei controlling the larynx or the respiratory muscles. And so that's the pathway then. By activating the system at the level of the central gray, we then send fibers activation down to lower parts of the brain to cause these vocalizations. Oops, I went too fast. Now, how do I get out of here? Let's see. Oh, okay. I'm not sure if this was the next slide or not. I think it was. Okay. So, I'm finished with the brainstem now. Now we're going to go into higher structures. Okay? So this picture just shows us parts of the brain, and we see connections through various nerves to muscles of the tongue, the eye, inputs from the ear, etc. Now, another thing to think about when we get into higher parts of the brain is not only do we have a cerebral cortex, but the cerebral cortex interacts with subcortical structures. For example, the basal ganglia. As many of you are probably aware, there are disorders of the basal ganglia resulting in neurological disorders. Parkinson's disease is one such disorder, and there's fairly complex interactions between the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia that are very important for understanding disorders such as Parkinson's disease, Huntington's chorea, etc. Now, turning to the cerebral cortex, I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about the details here. In this diagram, we see sensory function located posteriorly to your left, and motor functions in front of that. And it's very organized. At the top part of the brain, we have our lower extremities, our feet, legs, and then as we go down along the surface of the brain, we go up in the body, so that our head, neck, face, laryngeal control are all located down there towards the bottom. And here's another image that is important to keep in mind, because this lists a lot of the other functions that we're concerned with. For example, Broca's area for word formation, limbic association, cortex, Wernicke's area, another important language area of the brain. So these and many others are quite important for us to think about when we're interested in vocalization and speech control. So, which parts of the cerebral cortex are involved in voice control? And how do we study these? Well, one way of doing it is we study patients with brain dysfunction. Injury or disease, we use imaging techniques such as Fmri or EEG. But we can also study this in normal people. We ask them to vocalize while they're in an Fmri magnet or PET imaging or record EEG. So we can do this as they're vocalizing or singing or speaking. Now, this shows some Fmri images obtained by Stephen Brown, and he was interested in where the larynx is located in the brain. And so he did Fmri studies on normal people, and he defined an area that's located on the lower left-hand side and upper left-hand side of the area of the brain that controls the larynx. Here's another study that he did, contrasting monotonic vocalization with harmonization, or harmonization versus rest. And the point I'm trying to make by showing this to you is that there are several different areas. There's not a single area that is just controlling vocalization. It depends on the type of vocalization, how it's elicited, and other things that I'm going to talk about more in a few minutes. This is a contrast done by Tori Laux when he was at NIH, and the top shows repetitive vocalization with continuous vocalization, showing that different parts of the brain are activated. And then in the middle, vocalization at rest, again we see different parts of the brain that are activated. There you see several different initials. These are initials pertain to different parts of the brain that I'm not going to go into here. It's much beyond this. But then at the bottom we see exhalation versus rest. Again, multiple areas. And here's another view showing brain activations with voice pitch modulation. And again, you see several different areas that are activated. These are the same investigators where they had subjects vary the pitch of their vocalization. And again, we see different parts of the brain that are activated. Now, putting all this together, I took data from these other studies and superimposed them on this part of the brain and actually wrote out the names of them. And again, they may not mean much to you, but nevertheless, various studies have found that these are parts of the brain that are involved in vocalization. And as a plug at the bottom, I hope you'll come to hear Robert Satori give his talk tomorrow, because he probably more than anybody else I can think of has determined the functions of these different parts of the brain as far as vocalization is concerned. He's really one of the top investigators in the field, and he's a wonderful speaker. You'll really enjoy his talk. So, another question we have then is, how do we control our voice? Well, we can think of it as a two-stage process. First of all, we use what we call an internal model. That is a memory of what we said before, what we learned, and what we want to say. And after vocal onset, then we use feedback. We use feedback to help control it. So, we approach voice control from the modeling perspective, meaning that we are the subject, we are the ones speaking or singing or vocalizing. We have an action. We want to sing, we want to speak, so our brain sends signals to the muscles, and then the muscles contract, and we get sensory feedback from them that we use to help control these actions. Now, the way we do work in our lab is we study vocal control by changing auditory feedback. We play a trick on these people. They're vocalizing, all of a sudden the voice they hear isn't their own. And that's how we study the voice in these people. So we could do somatosensory feedback, but we prefer to use auditory feedback. Frankly, it's much easier to do. And so we developed what we call the pitch shift technique. And basically, we have people vocalizing, going, ah, and the voices run through what we call a pitch shifter, and we change the pitch and feed it back to them. And what we've found when we do that is that it causes a change in the voice output. So at the top, there's a black line, relatively steady, and then there's a line that goes below that's labeled compensating response, because if you look at the little bracket at the top of the stimulus, it's an upward stimulus, meaning it's an upward change in pitch feedback results in the person lowering their voice FO output. The bottom half of the figure shows exactly the opposite, where there's a reduction in voice pitch feedback, and the person raises their fundamental frequency. So what this is, it represents, actually we've finally come around to the fact that this is a reflex. It's a basic reflex we all have. And so we've been studying this for quite some time now. We've also done this in speech. We had subjects say the phrase, Nina, and we delivered these pitch shift stimuli right at the beginning of the ni, like that. And we found responses were much larger. So as the person was trying to say the Nina, or like that, if the pitch wasn't right, then they automatically corrected for it in order to produce the right inflection of the voice. Now, we've also done fMRI using this technique, and this slide shows areas of the brain that are activated with pitch shifting. Again, more figures showing the activation of the brain area with pitch shifting. This is a little bit different. This is from electrocorticography done by a physician at the University of Iowa, in which they have, see these rectangles? Those are grids of electrodes. They put directly on the surface of the brain for people with severe epileptic seizures. And they put a lot of bandages on the people, and they put them in the hospital bed for 2 weeks, monitoring their brain to try to figure out where in the brain these seizures are coming from. Well, these people are pretty bored in a hospital bed for 2 weeks, and so people do experiments on them. And I got involved in this, and so we would do this pitch shifting with them. And we found there, I labeled this motor cortex. That part of the brain was activated 30 milliseconds after the onset of the pitch shift stimulus. So that tells us that that pitch shift stimulus went from the ear up to this part of the cortex in 30 milliseconds for this reflex. And then we also see that inferior frontal gyrus was also activated slightly later than that. So we've also done work in the lab on musicians, trained musicians and untrained subjects using pitch-shifted feedback. This is work done by Nadine Ibrahim and Roosman, who's now at the University of South Carolina. So we did pitch shifting with them and EEG recording, and we found out that the trained musicians had more rapid responses than the untrained subjects, and they recovered much more quickly than the untrained subjects. So what this means is that trained singers are really used to hearing their auditory feedback and responding immediately to make sure they try to produce the correct sound. We also did EEG on them, and we found that these singers with absolute pitch had some greater amplitude EEG potentials than either the non-absolute musicians or the non-musicians themselves. So this is just some work we did in trying to understand how musicians with absolute pitch or relative pitch differ from untrained singers. And finally then, what we also found is that the singers with absolute pitch shifted the control of their voice over to the left hemisphere more quickly than the relative pitch musicians or the non-trained musicians. What this means is that for the musician with perfect pitch or absolute pitch, they involve the language system. They seem to involve the language system of the brain to a different degree than the musicians with relative pitch or the non-musicians. I am going to stop there because it's time to hear Johan Sundberg, and I hope I've convinced you that there's more to voice control than just the diaphragm. Okay? It's important, I don't deny it, but we got a brain too.
Yeah, guess what? I'm going to talk about breathing, the breathing apparatus, and how we could use it for phonatory purposes. First, a few words about the relevance of breathing to voice. There are some basic facts that really show that breathing is very important to voice. One reason is that we need to start phonation at several points in time. And there are different types of doing that. One is the heart attack, where you start with adducting the vocal folds, like this. Here starts adduction, and then the blue is the subglottal pressure that comes after. So you start with, maybe you wanted to close your glottis and open it, just to feel how it is. When you do this, that is what you do, open and close your glottis. And then if you close the glottis before you start to phonate, then you have the heart attack. You could also go to adduction and subglottal pressure onset at the same time, and then you get the staccato, which is funny because you open the glottis between the phonation periods, so you need to reduce subglottal pressure to 0 between the tones in order not to lose all the air that you have in the lungs. And then the breathy attack starts with the subglottal pressure, and then you do the glottal adduction afterwards. So that is then creating the third type of attack. All this is a question of the synchronization between subglottal pressure start and adduction. So that is a reason, and the subglottal pressure is of course regulated by the respiratory system. So accurate control over subglottal pressure is a crucial factor for control of voice onset. Next reason is the tracheal pull, which is a mechanical link between the breathing system and the glottal system. That is often overlooked with regard to its importance to voice. The fact is that we have lungs, as we know, and they are hanging in the hyoid, and the hyoid is hanging in the skull. The lungs are quite big, so they have mass, and they want to travel south as everything in downwards, so that they actually pull the larynx downward. That is called the tracheal pull. The tracheal pull induces an abducting force that tends to widen the glottis. That was mentioned already in the 1920s and developed in the 60s by Zenker. So you have the tracheal pull tries to pull the larynx down and thereby trying to separate the vocal folds. This is a mechanical effect. And that means that the tracheal pull counteracts pressed phonation, because pressed phonation is phonation with exaggerated glottal adduction when you have that kind of phonation. So that is another reason why breathing strategy is relevant to voice. Tracheal pull is strong when the diaphragm is far down in the trunk. That is typically after inhalation, which is associated with expansion of the abdominal wall and widening of the flanks. The tracheal pull is weak in the other extreme of the breathing phase when the diaphragm is high after exhalation by contracting of the abdominal wall muscles, which is typically happening after exhalation and at the end of phrases. So lung volume affects voice in untrained subjects. So in untrained subjects, they typically run into more breath phonation toward the end of the phrase when the lung volume is small. That means that the diaphragm is a bit higher in the trunk. But in singer can't use that kind of mechanism, the automatic mechanism, so they need to acquire control over what the effect is. Now let me just mention an application, ascending or descending melodic exercises. Well, if you do an exercise, you always have to spend air. So you start with high lung volume, and then the lung volume goes down and down. And maybe you want to use the high lung volume for the high pitches, then you should have a descending melody direction. So here the high note is at high lung volume and the low note is at lung volume. And when could that be nice to use? Well, for students who are tending to use breath phonation at high pitches, because then you use the tracheal pull in order to avoid breath phonation at the high pitches. But you could also find people who have breathy voice at high pitches, and then perhaps an ascending melodic direction is better, because then the high note appears at a place where the tracheal pull is less and the glottal adduction is not so much counteracted by tracheal pull. Yeah, that was that. Hence, the accurate control over subglottal pressure is crucial for control of a voice onset. Now, reason number 3 is that the subglottal pressure is heavily influencing phonation. So whenever you change subglottal pressure, you are likely to change the phonatory conditions. So you could influence, this is subglottal pressure, and this is now the closing rate of the glottis that Dr. Scherer will talk about more in a little moment. The duration of the closed phase in the vibratory cycle, the amplitude of the flow pulses, and the amplitude of the voice source fundamental that Dr. Safaloff was talking about. So all these things are affected by subglottal pressure. And then also the amplitude of the higher partials are also affected. So accurate control over subglottal pressure is a crucial function for taking control over the voice and its acoustic and perceptual properties. Now I would like to turn into reminding you about how the breathing apparatus is constructed. There are 3 forces that affect the breathing system. One is the muscular system, one is the elasticity, and one is the gravitation. So muscles, that as Dr. Sasaloff talked about, we have external and internal intercostals, that are muscles that go are located between the ribs, and then we have the diaphragm and the abdominal wall as the second system for ventilation of the lungs. The intercostals travel between the ribs, as you could see, and there are external, and they lift the ribs so that expands the rib cage, and they are good for inhalation. And then the internal, they are more perpendicular orientation, so they squeeze the rib cage and are used for exhalation. Then we have the abdominal wall muscles. That is the second system for breathing. Abdominal wall muscles, there are lots of them, and they are strong. And their antagonist is the diaphragm. Where is the diaphragm? Well, many people believe that this is the diaphragm. They are wrong. This is not the diaphragm. This is the diaphragm. It is a muscle that is the bottom of the rib cage. So when contracting, it lowers the rib cage floor and expands the lungs and also pushes out the abdominal wall. And if you contract the diaphragm against contracted abdominal wall, the diaphragm doesn't know what to do. It wants to shorten the periphery of its muscle. It can't because it stops. So then the only thing it can do is to lift the lower flanks of the rib cage. Some people say you cannot control your diaphragm, and they are also entirely wrong. Anybody could do it, and I invite you to do it right here and now. And the thing is that you make your stomach, your abdominal wall hard, and then you pronounce a soft S sound. And I ask you, is this difficult or impossible? Your answer is no. We can do it very easily. And what you do then is you have contraction of the abdominal wall and co-contraction, simultaneous contraction of the diaphragm that prevents the high pressure in the abdominal region to enter into the rib cage and raise the subglottal pressure. Okay, so that is simple. Now the shape of the lungs, some people regard the shape of the lungs more like this, and they are not correct either. That is not how the lungs are shaped, they are more like that. And this means then that if you inhale with the upper part of your lungs, you don't get so much air into your lungs. But if you do it by expanding the lower part of the rib cage, you get more air into the lungs. So that is the reason for a low type of breathing. Now to the elasticity that Dr. Satterloff was talking about. The elasticity forces have two directions. So one, why don't you take a deep breath and close your glottis and relax, and then open the glottis, and nobody will inhale, everybody exhales, because the elasticity at high lung volumes with lungs full of air is exhalatory. It wants to contract the rib cage. And at the other extreme, if you expel the air that you have in your lungs and close the glottis, relax, and then open the glottis, you will inhale. So elasticity is exhalatory at high lung volumes and inhalatory at low lung volumes. Yeah, can be easy to breathe. And that was how you could feel your elasticity by closing your glottis after a deep exhalation or a deep inhalation, and then relaxing, and then open the glottis. Okay, how do we measure pressure? It is very, very simple. You buy a tubing, a plastic tubing, and fold it into a U shape, and then you fill a little water into the tube, and then you put the pressure here at the open end, one open end, and that pushes the water level down in that part of the tubing, and then up in the other part, of course. And the measure is then the level difference between the levels of the water in the U tube. Centimeter of water column is the unit. Now, this is given this, you could imagine what would happen, what the elasticity forces causes into terms of subglottal pressure. Yeah, so it depends, of course, of the lungs, how much air you have in your lungs. If you have full lungs, you have a rather high subglottal pressure produced by the elasticity of the breathing system. So it could be up to 30 centimeters of watercolor. And then at low lung volumes, at empty lungs, when you have exhaled all you can, then you are in the negative side. So then it is a sucking force of minus 20 centimeters of watercolor, approximately, if you are standing up. Now, if you want to produce a tone with soft tone, and it is going to be a long tone, then you need to start with a high lung volume, and then counteract the exhalatory elasticity force such that you get the target subglottal pressure. And if you are intending to produce a very loud tone, maybe the elasticity produces the pressure that you need. So that is, it is amazing that we need to keep track of the lung volume in order to decide how much exhalatory or inhalatory force we have to use. And as Chuck Larson mentioned, we have a brain to handle these problems, and it's rather efficient in this respect. Expiratory level meets at some point in the lung volume scale. We pass the balance point between exhalatory and inhalatory elasticity forces, and oddly enough, it is a bit lower than than half of the lungs. So here the exhalatory elasticity forces are the strongest ones, and here the inhalatory elasticity forces is the strongest one. The resting expiratory level is an important lung volume for phonation. So how does it feel to be at REL? I invite you to experience it here and now. The method is quite easy. You just make a relaxed sigh like this. And then you are that. That's REL. And it's quite stable if you are not changing your posture. So that is what it feels like. Okay, I will probably return to REL in a little moment. And then we have gravitation. There is lots of kilos in the abdominal region, and they want to go south. So that means that if you are standing upright, then the gravitation helps you to inhale. Now I will talk about lung volumes, how much air you have in your lungs. And here we see the dashed line here is REL, here is lung volume, and here is a sort of time. Here is maximum inhalation, and then the maximum exhalation, and then that defines what is called the vital capacity, how much you could inhale and exhale. Normal breathing starts from REL. I told you that REL is an important lung volume, and this is one example. REL starts from, inhalation in relaxed breathing starts from REL, and then so that we use our muscles to inhale, and then we use the elasticity to exhale, because the elasticity is exhalatory above REL. If we, let's do that. You could visit your REL and then start talking without taking breath before. So, and then start to talk, and then I want you to feel how it feels. Okay, relax, sigh, and then talk, okay? Yeah, how nice was that? That was not nice. People don't like to speak under REL, and that is very important. Imagine or recall that REL is about half of the lung volume that we have to use. And then if we don't like the second half, the lower half of that, we don't have as much there as we might imagine for phonatory purposes. Okay, so this is what typically happens when in normal speech. We take a little portion of air and then we use it for phonation, and then when we come close to resting expiratory level, we take another breath. Opera singers often have to deal, and professional singers often have to deal with very long phrases, so they need to use very big, start with very much air in the lungs, use high lung volumes, and that means then that they need to deal with much stronger elasticity forces than we do in untrained speech. In singing, phrases are typically around 10 seconds long, and why is that? Well, when we are phonating, we use about 1 or 2 deciliters of air per second. So in 10 seconds we may have been finishing all the air we had above REL, and then we want to have an inhalation. So the inhalations are in singing are often quite quick, and the exhalation is quite slow, 10 or 15 seconds long. And I have just heard that this has a good health effect. So don't exhale quickly. You will be better off with your health if you exhale slowly, as if you are singing in a choir or for yourself. Okay, singing is good. Okay. So blood pressure now, which is a hugely important aspect of the respiratory function in phonation. How does the blood pressure feel? Well, I invite you to experience it by pronouncing an S sound, consonant, that is shifting between soft and loud. That is how your subglottal pressure is feeling in your own body. It can be measured by drilling a little hole into your trachea, and that hurts, and it's not ethically nice. So it's much easier to measure the pressure in the oral cavity when you pronounce a P consonant, because if you are pronouncing a P, the glottis is open, and if it's not open, it will be a B. So you could measure the subglottal pressure in the mouth cavity during P occlusion. Different singers use very, very different pressure ranges. So this is a dramatic sopranos. They go up to what could be 40 centimeters of water column, and countertenors, they are they go about 20 centimeters. By the way, did you know an octave on the keyboard is 17 centimeters, so that may be nice to remember at some point. But that's totally irrelevant, sorry. Okay. Subglottal pressure variation. Here is the point, and here is the difference, the crucial, the monumental difference between singing and not singing. In lab speech, when you speak because somebody told you and you don't want to communicate anything, then the subglottal pressure is mostly constant. It just lies there, lazy, and doesn't do anything. In storytelling, when you have a communicating purpose of your talking, you vary subglottal pressure quite dramatically. In stage speech, when you address a large auditorium in a large theater, then the excursions could be very, very big. And in singing also, they are systematically changed. The subglottal pressure is systematically changed. This is worth to contemplate. And much more. You see the pressure for the first tone. So the see that the pressure needs to be tailored to the pitch. The pressure needs to be tailored to the pitch. And this is specific to voice, to singing. And it is, of course, terribly important because you have to be there with your breathing activity so that you are there with the pressure when you enter the tone. Otherwise you won't hit the tone. Either way it will be too soft or too loud or out of tune. So this is a crucial difference between singing and non-singing. Well, that was the end of my little story about the singing and the subglottal pressure and the breathing apparatus. There are two muscle systems, the intercostals and the diaphragm abdominal wall. And then this breathing apparatus also contains elasticity forces and gravitation forces. The lung volume, the elasticity forces are equal at the resting expiratory level, and we don't like to be to talk and sing below our resting expiratory level. The lung volumes used in speech are quite small, but maybe quite large in singing if the composer composes a long phrase. Subglottal pressure controls vocal loudness. It is tuned according to also to pitch in singing, and it is varied for prosodic purposes in communication speech. And the tracheal pull is a mechanical link between phonation and respiration. Trachea strives to lower the larynx and to abduct the vocal folds. The effect is stronger at high lung volumes, and there is less adduction at lower lung volumes and at than at high lung volumes. Now that is the end of what I wanted to say, and there are a few moments for questions and maybe also answers if you have something that you would like to hear more about. Yeah.
If you go back one slide to the graph, the pressure graph, I was curious why after the note peak on the D, why you have a residual pressure increase on the C then as you're going down.
That's a very good question, and the thing is that you need to adapt the pressure to the pitch, but also to the phrase. And the phrase starts in a tonic up, and then comes the great dramaturgic event in the phrase, namely it turns over to the dominant 7, and that is then the target of the phrase. So it's an exercise that sort of trains the tuning of the subglottal pressure according to pitch and phrasing.
Thank you.
Some more? Yes?
Okay, so of course the question has always been, can you control the diaphragm or can you not control the diaphragm?
But that is not the question. You can control the diaphragm. That's no question.
But so you absolutely can, directly control the diaphragm?
Yeah, if you want. Yes.
But directly, it's not by the means of other muscles.
No, it goes its own way when you have hiccups. Then you can control it. But otherwise, it does what provided that you know how it feels and how to do it. But I mean, when we breathe, we use the diaphragm for inhalation. So we use it without knowing all the time throughout life. Yeah.
Is it indirect, that the intercostal muscles are actually what's controlling the diaphragm? Is the movement of the intercostal muscles rather than controlling the diaphragm directly?
I have heard that the breathing system is, this is a question for Chuck Larson, I think, but I could try, that the breathing system is controlled from a neural pool that is then controlling both the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles.
Simultaneous,
Oh.
like if there's a participatory.
Yeah, they belong to the same control system. Yes.
But if, you know, if you're an actor or a singer, you're actually moving your wrists rather than trying to move the diaphragm.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think the diaphragm is. I have seen singers, as Dr. Sasselov mentioned. So we measured the activity of the diaphragm, and some singers were using contraction of the diaphragm throughout the praise, and other singers, they used the diaphragm contraction only for reducing subglottal pressure when they were shifting from a high note to a low note in the beginning of the phrase, when they have a lot of exhalatory elasticity. Yes, so you need to hit the low pressure for the low note, and you have to do it quickly, and then they contract the diaphragm.
Always be using the intercostals in both cases.
Now we didn't see what they were doing sideways. Ron, you had a question.
Yeah, one approach to this question is probably from an antagonistic muscle point of view and the control of the lung pressure that you want at any particular time. So the diaphragm is contrary to the abdominal muscles, so they're antagonistic. The internal and external are antagonistic. Then there's also that play between those two groups. So most likely, I would guess that if the diaphragm is contracting, you should be contracting against abdominal muscle, so that control is always right there. But you always have to ask, as you were just saying, what is the goal? And the goal might be to, in this case, control the lung pressure for sound production. And then what is the orientation, the theoretical and the practical orientation of support, posture, and all those things.
But it's also...
And my guess, though, is that the diaphragm is always kind of looking at what the antagonistic action is that's necessary for it to be active.
Yeah, you do as you please. I mean, you could inhale with the diaphragm, and then the abdominal wall goes out. Or if you don't want it to go out, you could pull it in.
So you're saying that you can voluntary control.
Yeah, everything is. Yeah.
But they have a relationship to each other.
Yeah, and the entrance ticket to voluntary control is to know what the function is, so that you know that this is the abdominal wall, and this is diaphragm, and this is rib cage.
The diaphragm is very moving.
Yeah.
The diaphragm get very.
Yeah, that's a pedagogical aspect. Yes. Yeah, we should stop.
Well, I was just going to say, well, the Italians always call that the vocal contest between the vocal contest between the abdominal wall and
Yeah.
diaphragm, and I guess what you're saying is what you do with that is actually controlling.
Yeah, you need to, and the tracheal put is related to where the diaphragm is in the body. I have two announcements before the break, and one is that we are having a break, and there you could go to the Grand Ballroom, Salon number 3, and visit the exhibit hall. And then also you could also go and visit the registration desk, because there are gala tickets still available to buy. Okay, have a nice break.